We also have faced other negative press on the international scale. Barbados was mentioned in the Panama Papers, we were mentioned in the Paradise Papers, and it culminated at the end of 2017 with our being blacklisted by the EU. So how does a small island like ours continue to attract major international players when we have faced the reputational damage that would be associated with the blacklisting and the mention in the Panama Papers and Paradise Papers and so on? So in our current context, we need to look to the future because we no longer have these kind of protectionist mechanisms whereby we can attract major players anymore. We need to get a little more creative. What I found in my research was that the International Growth Center from the London School of Economics defines a term called quality foreign direct investment, and that's the kind of direct investment that we need to seek. It is investment that contributes to the creation of decent value-adding jobs. It enhances the skill base of host economies. It facilitates the transfer of technology and know-how. It boosts competitiveness of domestic firms and enables access to markets and operates in a socially and environmentally responsible manner. So how can we attract those kind of players in our context? The World Bank Investor Survey of multinational corporations referenced that the three most important factors, even more important than incentivization today, are political stability, security, and a proper regulatory environment. That basically references the ease of doing business in the country. We currently reside at 132nd on the ease of doing business survey, and I believe that there are a few areas that we can work on in terms of our efficiency, the efficiency with which applications and permits are granted. We need to focus on our service delivery. We need to ensure that our infrastructure is such that transportation and infrastructure that would facilitate attracting the kind of growth that we would like to seek is available. We need to ensure that our workforce is skilled so that we can attract the desired high-level sectors. And also they reference a benefit to having an investment promotion agency such as Export Barbados, where a potential investor can liaise directly with a firm like that to know exactly what is required and to facilitate the process of becoming established in our economy. What I also decided to do was to investigate what we currently have on our books that may facilitate investment in the absence of this act. One of the things that I came across was the International Business Act, CAP 77, which referenced that international business companies can enter Barbados and can import duty-free machinery and raw materials. They're exempted from exchange control restrictions and import duties. They can also have zero-rated value-added tax, and they are taxed at a nominal rate of 1 to 2.5%. So even without the Fiscal Incentives Act, there's still certain mechanisms that are already in existence that an international player may be able to access in order to make doing business more attractive here. So with those few words, sir, I'm obliged.
Thank you, Senator. I next recognize Senator Greenwich.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, I sat here today and listened to the speakers one after the other. And to be quite honest, I felt as though I was not really in the Senate. I felt as though I was at a funeral, and that it was the funeral of the Fiscal Incentives Act. Indeed, I regarded every speaker, one after the other, as paying a short eulogy in some cases, a tribute in other cases, to an act which has indeed served Barbados fairly well. An act that has now become obsolete, an act that, as far as I'm concerned, has outlived its usefulness. But I did learn from many of the tributes, I did learn from them that the act also facilitated manufacturing. I learned that it stimulated manufacturing in Barbados. It assisted with the creation of jobs. Companies and businesses were able to enjoy, in some cases, upward of 15 years tax holiday. So the act did give some measure of economic prosperity to Barbados. This gesture by the Barbados government of the day was very attractive to many companies who came to set up business in Barbados. Indeed, the success was such that, as we heard from Senator Walcott this morning, the success was such that they moved away from simply manufacturing, and they encompassed and they extended to agriculture and fisheries. So we can still find something good to say about the Fiscal Incentives Act. Things went very well for us until we ran afoul of the WTO rules. Now, I want at this stage too to just take a minute to compliment the BADC for what yeoman service that institution has given to the Barbados manufacturing landscape. I have a special connection with the BADC. Indeed, my brother, he worked with the BADC for many, many years. He worked here in Barbados, and then he was posted to New York, and he did a very good job. And I have to say that there were times when we sat together, and a point which he always made was that our labor costs, our wages and so on, tend to drive us out of the market in relation to some of our competitors. He always made that point. And we would sit and recall the days of smoking. I don't know how many of us here can remember those days. People doing smoking and so on. We had some of our relatives who did it too. We had some. If you're too young, if Senator Hayes, if you might be too young, and Senator Cummings. Yeah, you say you have to take them on President Kennedy drive and hand them in.
She's younger than me, actually.
But I know the young folks who wouldn't know what I'm talking about. But the point.
You're not the hair sites.
Senator Walker was just saying that he saw Senator Brad, that he saw Senator Brad handed in his. But the point is that people made enough, especially the young ladies, they made so much, they made money from it. And they could eke out a living by making smoking. But as Senator Nurse, he made the point, and Senator Holder also made the point, alas, there were other places which did business a lot cheaper than we did in Barbados. It's a pity to see all those things go by the wayside. Now, I want also to make mention, Mr. President, of the fact that we shouldn't forget that government will still have the opportunity to provide other incentives and other concessions. Indeed, early this morning, Senator Grant, he was asking for concessions in other areas. But in an ideal world, incentives which are given by government to businesses to enable them to stimulate employment and to create economic growth, those incentives and those concessions should be even-handed, they should be free from bias, and they should be non-partisan. In other words, as we always keep saying, the playing field should be as level as possible. But far too often in Barbados, we hear Barbadians say that certain concessions or incentives are unfair. Some agricultural projects will get, others will not. Some hotels will get, others will not. Some supermarkets will get, others will not. Some individuals will get, and others will not. And so Barbadians who have become very discerning will say these concessions are not fair. Truth be told, the concessions which most governments give, they're usually extremely genuine, extremely well-meaning on the part of government. But as a government, we have to realize that we must guard against the perception and the appearance of preferential treatment. You're giving some and not giving others. I didn't want to call any name, but I heard somebody say something. The Barbadian public today, Mr. President, is a very discerning public. Very, very discerning. There are some who will tell you that businesses who benefit from government concessions and government incentives remain indebted and remain obligated to government, and that those businesses will be expected to return the favor to government sometime in some form or fashion. And that's the way the Barbadian public thinks today. It is a matter of, I think it's Lil Rick that has the song that says, do for do. And people look at it that way even today. And let us not fool ourselves, because this is precisely why some businesses donate. Precisely why they donate. And some of them, when they donate, they behave as though they alone made a donation. They want everything. They behave as though they have purchased government. I have heard of companies and individuals who are prepared to donate to one party and not the other. You know, and there are also those who donate to to 1, 2, and 3 parties so that regardless of who is in office, they would be entitled to something. In fact, I can hear someone saying it's like an insurance policy. The point was made quite recently by Sir David Simmons when he appeared before the Integrity Bill Committee. And he said that that tap, he didn't put it that way, but the tap of like corruption is unlocked even at the stage of your campaign funding. That companies and conglomerates and even individuals who give, and they give large sums of money, and they do it because they expect something in return. And he's calling on us to make some type of restriction, some type of check, so that we will run ourselves into problems later. But, Mr. President, government must therefore watch its every step. The Barbados public, I say again, is becoming very, very discerning. I think his lyric too that is saying something about things are not what they used to be. Once upon a time you could get away with certain things in the 1960s and in the 1970s when this Fiscal Incentives Act came into being. You could have got away with certain things. You can't get away with those things today. Things have changed. And that penetrating eye of the Barbadian is always on you. Barbadians today will watch our Prime Minister, will watch our senators, will watch our cabinet ministers. They will watch who go to cricket and sit in their box and whose box they sit in. They will watch whose party you go to and who go to your parties. They will watch who you take to lunch and who take you to lunch. They'll watch whose car you are driving and who is driving your car. It's not what it used to be. There is today a lot of, mistrust, a lot of questioning, a lot of scrutiny by the Barbadian eye. And I make the point, and I took that path today as I close, because the basic point I want to make is that I urge this government not to allow any company or any individual to carry you in the palm of their hands. I'm obliged to you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, thank you very much. I rise on this occasion to lend my support to the repeal of this bill and my voice to the call made by others in this House and elsewhere for it to be replaced with a series of measures or with a measure that takes into account what comes next. I preface my comments by saying, you know, Mr. President, I may look like I'm younger on a good day, but I am the mother of an almost 19-year-old daughter. And there are those moments in time where I consider that when she was a baby, I would put her into the car and I helped her into her car seat and I would strap her car seat for her and get her settled before I drove off. And then as she got older, she could climb in by herself. She strapped herself in and I moved off, and now she drives herself. I hardly drive with her. She has grown into a young woman capable of doing for herself now that which I no longer am required to do. And I give that example, Mr. President, in the context of this bill that was established in 1974 on April 14th, and here we are in 2018 having a discussion around what the manufacturing sector, not just here in Barbados, but across the Caribbean, because this was a CARICOM-wide bill act, which was appended to the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas. And so all the countries in our region would have treated to this matter in an identical fashion. And as is the case, Mr. President, with my daughter who no longer sits in a car seat, and who I no longer strap into her seat, and who I no longer drive to school on mornings, who handles her own business on her own, because the times have changed, so too have the times changed with regard to the circumstances that led to the introduction of this measure in 1974. In 1974, Mr. President, we had almost a monocrop-based economy. We were dependent largely on commodity-based trade. We did not have a high level of diversification, and we did not have a wide or deep level of integration into the Caribbean space. And it was felt at the time that to move away from agriculture and to divest into agriculture even more deeply, that we needed to give additional support to certain types of industries, and manufacturing at the time was that industry. By 1994, Mr. President, by the time the World Trade Organization came into being in Barbados, and many of our other CARICOM countries signed up to the World Trade Organization in 1995, the world had changed significantly. We were no longer in rear-facing car seats as we were in 1974. We were in front-facing car seats. Those of us who have children would understand, or who drive children in cars. We turned the car seat around and they were facing and they were strapping themselves in. 20 years later, we undertook at that time, Mr. President, a series of commitments, which in the trade community we call a single undertaking. It meant, Mr. President, that with our accession to the WTO agreement, establishing the multiple agreements under which the trading infrastructure would then be constructed, we undertook several obligations under which we then had to have domesticated legislation put in place. This act was not compatible then with the rules of the WTO as they were conceptualized. And I heard Senator Drakes earlier ask about the convenience of the timing of the removal of this, now that the country is going to be able to extract additional taxes from which they would have been exempted from a certain number of industries. And I want to point out, Mr. President, that at the time of our entry into the World Trade Organization in 1994, we were already out of compliance. And we were given a time frame under the WTO, which has been elaborated on in the course of these discussions, that we then, I think most recently, as the speaker, two speakers ago, Senator Haynes, she mentioned that we have annual exemptions and that this was supposed to have been replaced several years ago, and we are now speeding towards the absolute deadline of September 2018, where we have to find ourselves in compliance. Now, Mr. President, there's always a lot of discussion whenever we have these kinds of debates around why would a small developing country like Barbados with a limited resource base find itself in an entity like the World Trade Organization, whereby we are burdened with what we may consider to be onerous obligations. Mr. President, there are 164 members of the international community who are just like Barbados, including the European Union and the larger markets like the United States and so on. There are 23 countries that have observer status. Those countries who are not a part of this architecture include countries like Syria, Iran, Iraq, Azerbaijan. Those are not countries with which Barbados typically keeps company. But if we are talking about a country with countries with which Barbados keeps company, Bahamas still is the only country in the Americas, and certainly in CARICOM, that is not a full member of the World Trade Organization. They applied for observer status in 2000. By 2001, they moved to join the rest of the international community as full members. So they too understood the international trade infrastructure, which was prefaced by the WTO, what it meant for their trade ambitions. We are now in 2018, and despite the stellar work by a former Prime Minister of Barbados, among others, to craft a negotiated accession into the World Trade Organization for the Bahamas, they are still not yet a full member of the WTO. And so I give that background to say that trade liberalization commitments become important policy instruments for countries around the world, large and small. Many times, as part of these liberalization commitments, tariff obligations are offset by other non-tariff measures, including tax measures. This is a tax measure, and so in the strictest sense, someone may ask, why are we under an act called the Fiscal Incentives Act, referencing the World Trade Organization as a point of reference with whom we are out of compliance? Mr. President, the reality of it is that tariff measures, along with non-tariff measures like tax incentives and other regulatory measures which have a protectionist impact, whether they be subsidies, countervailing measures, we're talking about things here like voluntary export restraints and those kinds of things, which may not be used in the same way anymore. They all have the overall impact of distorting trade, distorting markets. But what's most important for us here in Barbados, in the context of this discussion, and given what has been said before, it has the important impact of distorting pricing to consumers. So we spent a lot of time today and normally talking about the impact on the manufacturing sector and the impact on producers and those kinds of things, but there are thousands of Barbadians, hundreds and thousands of Barbadians who are paying more for certain products because they are ring-fenced by protectionism. We are supporting, with many of these incentives and these protectionist measures, in some instances, unprofitable enterprises and subsidizing them and making them profitable at the expense of consumers. And in other instances, we are making profitable, we are cross-subsidizing profitable institutions and feeding into the coffers of private enterprise, who then benefit from the sacrifices of taxpayers who are also consumers. So while these incentives may benefit, on the one hand, a smaller number of producers, they actually disadvantage our consumers or retailers, who then have to pass on the cost because we are paying a higher price for a product that is produced in a certain jurisdiction because we want to provide incentives. But there are occasions where, especially in small countries like ours, where protectionist measures are important, because that is what this is. It is a protectionist measure designed to support infant industry development. And I started my comments today, Mr. President, by referencing my now 19-year-old daughter and when she was first born deliberately, because protectionist measures typically are designed to support infant industries. They're not meant to support adult industries. And the question for us as Barbados is whether or not we are putting sufficient resources into making that transition from an infant industry into a well-developed, well-sustained, export-oriented, outward-looking, and competitive adult enterprise that has benefited from and made full use of the incentives and the support provisions that have been made available to them. I want to say, Mr. President, that you have a long history in Barbados of protected industries remaining uncompetitive, unproductive, and at high cost decades after protectionist measures were first introduced. We're doing something wrong. The solution here is not what we're going to replace this measure with in terms of an additional protectionist measure that now in this instance may be WTO compatible. The question is, how do we enable domestic producers, regional producers functioning in the national space to be, one, competitive, two, export-oriented and generate higher levels of foreign exchange, and three, themselves become outward-moving in terms of being transnational firms. We are hardly seeing the movement of capital or even firms establishing commercial presences outside of the Caribbean. Mr. President, I want to give an example because it was raised today, and it's actually one of my favorite examples when I'm talking on these particular subjects to talk about the importance of looking at specific sectors and what needs to happen. Mr. President, I use the example of the sugar industry. We functioned under the sugar industry for decades. We functioned under the Lome Agreement where we had a guaranteed quota, guaranteed quantity, guaranteed amount, guaranteed price going into the European Union every single year. All across the African region, the Caribbean, and the Pacific, it was the same. Europe undertook to import about $1.8 billion worth every year in sugar. Barbados had about 3.9% of that total quota. At the end of the process where the UK went into Europe, and we had a review of what we call the Common Agricultural Policy, which also would have looked at the inputs downstream in manufacturing, Barbados was found to be the most, not one of the most uncompetitive producer of sugar in the entire African, Caribbean, Pacific region. Functioning under a protectionist guaranteed system, we failed to invest in our own development. We failed to invest in the transformation of an important sector. And unlike countries like Mauritius that reinvested the surplus earnings from sugar into other sectors and industries where they diversified and created new industries, Barbados never did that. And so we had a narrative in the country for many decades around protectionism as if on its own it was a good thing. But where protectionism has been found to function effectively has been in jurisdictions that then use the time functioning behind the barrier of protection to invest in transformation. That is the conversation we need to be having with Barbados today. That is the conversation we need to be having with our sectors in the manufacturing industry today. Over lunch, one of my colleagues, we were having a joke, and we were talking about going into the supermarket and seeing flying fish and refusing to buy it because it was made elsewhere. Now, Mr. President, I said to my colleague at the time, I'm not going to answer you here, I'm going to answer you from the floor of the Senate. And I'm answering her from the floor of the Senate. When we, for example, for many years, Mr. President, chose to have a debate over whether or not a highly migratory species like the flying fish moving from Barbados when they're spawning into the warmer waters of Tobago when they're ready to come to maturity, we have been having this conversation in a vacuum outside of the existing arrangements that allow us to actually take advantage of that very thing. It's called the Revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, the primary agreement to which this very preliminary act was appended to. The Revised Treaty of Chaguaramas allows us, as Barbadian manufacturers, to establish a commercial presence in Tobago under the Revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, on all of the CARICOM arrangements, to set up fish processing firms in Tobago, and then use the provisions of CARICOM to ship those processed fish back into Barbados. A $39 million market, according to what Trinidad's data tells us. There are about 5 providers, 5 processing firms. None of them are of Barbadian origin. Or one of them, I think, is of Barbadian origin. One. Yet we are battling over whether or not we should send fish down there or we should buy fish, when the reality of it is that our manufacturing sector, our agro-processing sector, has remained inward-looking in too many instances, and it needs to use the arrangements that are available to it. The solution to replacing this legislation is not with replacing it with similar legislation, because we have any number of pieces of legislation, any number of trade agreements that we're not using, any number of market access opportunities in foreign markets that we're not exporting to. We have an EPA that was signed in 2008, and with the exception of the Dominican Republic exporting in both agriculture and manufacturing and services, Suriname, I'm being reminded, we are not using the mechanisms that are available to us. We had a loan. We talk about competitiveness. We had a grant loan. We have resources made available to us financially to run a competitiveness project for 5 years. Under the previous administration, 3 years into the project, no work had been done on competitiveness. And we're still here. So the question is not the replacement of protectionist measures. It is using what you have available to you to do what you are supposed to do and to expand into new spaces. That is what the challenge is. We're not necessarily looking at that. We have instances where countries like Switzerland does not produce chocolate. Switzerland imports chocolate from 2 small African nations, and then they use their dairy industry to add value, and then they have become the world's biggest producer of chocolate. The United Kingdom has no sugar production capacity. They import it from people like us as a raw material and then re-export it. So I like when my colleague Senator Drake, she said, if we had grapes in the Caribbean, we would not know what wine was. Because if we are the producers of things like chocolate, and we can't add value, if we're still having difficulty with what to do with things like the sugar industry, we're still producing cocoa, but we're only producing dark cocoa because we don't have a dairy industry. Switzerland is doing that. We have not rationalized our value-added production. And in having those conversations, encouraging our manufacturers, and by extension, every other sector, including services and agriculture, we are not doing them any justice by having a conversation about retention of the status quo, when the status quo, which they have had for many, many years, has not been utilized effectively. The conversation that we need to be having with our manufacturing sector it must be, how can we transform? And I'm going to use some data here because I'm going to give a few examples quickly as I come to my final points. In the case of Jamaica, Jamaica made some changes, some significant changes. They also had this act, like I said, it was a CARICOM-wide act. Jamaica made some changes. When Jamaica went to the WTO in 2017, and they had their trade policy review, in 2014, when Barbados was assessed, this was one of the concerns that was raised again, or non-compliance. But in Jamaica in 2017, they introduced, to replace their equivalent legislation, something called an omnibus fiscal incentives framework. It incorporated 3 items of legislation: Customs Import Duties Act, Additional Stamp Duties Act, and Corporate Income Tax Act. Well, let me say that differently. They were called 3 things: the Fiscal Incentives Act, Customs Tariff Amendment Resolution, and the Revised Stamp Duty Act. I want to spend a moment on the Customs Tariff Amendment. They, like this original legislation, identified sectors and enterprises, but there were sectors and enterprises that they recognized were infant, nascent, or high growth potential industries. They included things like, from exemption, intermediate goods, raw materials, because I think we had one of our colleagues raise the question of imports for the purpose of production, machinery and equipment, and then there were specific sectors: hotels, cottage industries, attractions, healthcare, and of course, in the context of Jamaica, the creative industries for film and for music. So they identified the sources of revenue on the basis of levels of development, and then they attached mechanisms to support those sectors. Those are the kinds of conversations that we're looking for in Barbados. I want to make 3 recommendations, Mr. President. I want to suggest that in order to help have this conversation in a meaningful way, the time has come where we have to look at the functioning of our institutions. We called a couple of institutions here, but Mr. President, I have to say that I am not confident that as we move away from 1974, we move away from 1994 when we joined the WTO, that in 2018, I am convinced that there are institutions that are all fit for purpose. There are some institutions that need to be transformed from the inside out in order to be able to deliver a 21st century trade infrastructure for Barbados and for our producers. And I want to suggest, Mr. President, on the government side, that perhaps, one of the first things we should be considering, Mr. President, is the creation of a special task force that incorporates the ministry responsible for trade at the level of commerce domestically, the ministry responsible for foreign trade on the export side, and all of the related line ministries, and the University of the West Indies for the purpose of research and development. I want also to suggest, Mr. President, that we strengthen our investment once more in research and development. There was a time in this region when there was an entity called the Caribbean Regional Negotiating Machinery. It was attached to the CARICOM Secretariat, and there was no subject on which you wanted to get information that you could not go to their website and access research, whether it was on the creative industries, if it was on export subsidies, if it was on rules of origin and accumulation so that we could accumulate resources and export. Whatever the subject was, the Caribbean Regional Machinery was one of the exemplars in research. That no longer obtains. That has not been the case since 2008. And in a region where all of our countries are constrained, in a country where all of our entities are constrained, we have to find a mechanism where we're investing significant amounts of resources and time into constant research. The world that we thought we lived in 5 years ago no longer exists, far less 1974. The world we thought we lived in when we joined the WTO in 1995 no longer exists, far less in 2021. The world is changing every day. And we have to enable our productive sectors to change with it in real time and to project ahead of those changes in real time in order to not just attain competitiveness, but to sustain it over time as transformation evolves. Michael Porter, one of my favorite writers, he talks about the competitive advantage of nations. And he says interesting things like, the competitive nation of today is overtaken by the competitive nation of tomorrow. So the notion that we can remain static and do what we've done all along in the same way tomorrow and still remain competitive, it doesn't obtain, Mr. President. And I would want us to make some changes. The third thing I want to suggest, Mr. President, is that we invest in the education of our private sector providers to expose them to new mechanisms, processes, and products, services. And here's what I mean. If we take the example of Singapore, or even Mauritius that I referenced earlier with regard to the sugar industry, Singapore identified that it wanted to diversify also out of agriculture. They wanted to go into niche manufacturing. We've talked a little bit about that here today. But high growth, technology-driven manufacturing. And what did they do? They twinned their education sector, particularly at the level of their technical institutions, their polytechnics and colleges. And they created an entire new cadre of skills to be able to service a new sector or new sectors being developed in Singapore. Now, when I was in my former job at the Barbados Coalition of Service Industries, and I say that because I commissioned this work and I have it available to me in front of me, one of the things we did in 2013, 2014 was to commission a study on the sectors that were trending globally. What was needed to get Barbados into that space and what skills were required. And we've been talking about manufacturing. Biotechnology, for example, was estimated at the time to be around $20.9 million in global value. And it was growing rapidly, just under 21% per annum. It was estimated that this was an opportunity for Barbados to diversify into high growth, high technology driven manufacturing, and that we had the skills, particularly among skill sets like our medical doctors, who every year we're having a discussion about whether or not there are enough places at the QEH hospital for them to go into clinical practice, when the reality of it is that there are so many other sectors in high niche growth manufacturing into which different skills can be repurposed and we can create new industries and sectors for Barbados. We also had things like data mining experts. We saw algorithm designers, industry-specific software specialists. These are skills that go into creating an entirely new sector. But instead, we're trying to machine sectors that have not been updated in 30 years, and depending on protectionist measures to prop them up. Mr. President, I want to submit to you that that cannot be the growth model for Barbados now or in the future. My final point I want to make is a response to Senator Nurse, who spoke about anti-dumping. I started out my comments by saying that when we signed on to the WTO and the GATT agreements, the set of agreements, we undertook to have a single undertaking. Single undertaking means that all of the agreements that fell under the WTO umbrella, we were bound by and we would be in compliance with their provisions. And contained in the WTO agreement at Article 7 in the GATT agreement, there's an entire section called anti-dumping and countervailing duties. And under those provisions, we are already applying, where applicable, obviously, any anti-dumping measures that need to be introduced. But I say that with the caveat that anti-dumping is one of the most difficult things in trade to prove. And as a result, when you look at the dispute settlement mechanism of the World Trade Organization, the United States is the largest advocate for anti-dumping measures in the WTO. It's not an extensively used provision. There are some countries, more and more, middle-income countries that are using these mechanisms, but it's very difficult to prove. And so I want to say that. The final thing is you raised about the credit guarantee schemes. I want to point out that, again, another underutilized provision that already exists that many of our people are not using. There is a export credit guarantee scheme under the central bank. There was another scheme that was capitalized a few years ago by the Inter-American Development Bank, and it is vested also in the Central Bank of Barbados. The government of Barbados, under that credit guarantee scheme, guaranteed 80% of the capitalization for an export measure, and then the intermediary banks would then pick up 20% of the risk. The intermediary banks in this country do not want to guarantee even 20% of the risk. And so it becomes a difficult provision to even put into place, except for the largest high-volume, large growth service providers. Does government need to provide additional assistance? My answer is probably no. We need to provide differentiated assistance. We need to provide assistance, but that is more carefully crafted. The measures to which we have become accustomed are not necessarily assistance. In some instances, as has been seen by so many of our sectors, they are actually hindrances. Assistance is required, but different assistance than we've used before. The best industries that have functioned in some of these spaces, you mentioned earlier, Lenstech is one of them. They function with no government support. They're an entirely private entity. They did what they had to do entirely on their own. And they weren't ring-fenced. We have another entity, the fertility clinic, for example, which is one of the largest inflows of medical tourism into this country. They're doing entirely what they have to do as a private sector entity with no government support. So the question is not ever going to be, do we need more government support? It is what kind of government support, and how do we get our providers, our manufacturers, our agriculturalists to use that support to transform and actually benefit the industry. And so with those words, Mr. President, I wish to not only support the repeal of this measure, which, one, has been ruled incompatible with our international obligations under the World Trade Organization, and I would dare say is also incompatible with our ambitions for a 21st century transformed manufacturing and productive sector. I'm obliged, Mr. President.
Mr. President, initially I had no intention whatsoever of speaking on this bill, but everybody provoked me. Especially Senator Greenidge, and I have to speak, and I'm going to be very short. Trust me, I'm going to be very short. My colleague had asked what will replace this fiscal incentives legislation. It was replaced long ago. It was replaced by something called the duties, taxes, and other payments exemptions. That has been used extensively to invite people into Barbados and waive taxes for them. Businesses that were unnecessary for like supermarkets and shopping complexes. We gave them all the concessions in the world. We had our local manufacturers. Barbados had merchants and so that operating for years. They built complexes in through the bridge, and Carlton, down St. James, and down in Black Rock, and no tax concessions whatsoever. And they managed to get their businesses done. But we invite people from overseas, from Canada, to come here, and not only did they not only come here, they came here and abuse our workers. They come by invitation, yes, thank you. They came by invitation. And people are asking what type of government support. They were supporting government ministers, you know. That is the problem, you know. So they came into Barbados, they felt that they could do whatever they like because they were... Former. Yes, thank you, former government ministers. Huh? How do I know? I know because of all the big sets of laptops and whatever, they call them, the flat screen TV, and all that stuff, that came in containers, that things were handed out in constituencies for Christmas and for Easter, and they could do anything about this what they like. I had a distinct displeasure of going to their offices to represent workers, and they said, we don't use it here. You know? They bought you and they got fired. But they feel they can do that because they had support, they support government. You know? So when the Fiscal Incentives Act came to bring people into Barbados to provide jobs, mind you, they weren't the best paying jobs, but provided jobs, this market that Senator Grant used to do. You know, it didn't pay a lot. It didn't pay a lot, but they provided jobs. No, the concessions that we were getting, we were inviting people into Barbados, giving them concessions, giving them, throwing everything you have at them, even the kitchen sink. The important thing, however, sir, I'm talking about the last administration. Everybody knows that. I don't want to call any names because I didn't tell the president that I was going to call any names, so I wouldn't do that. No. Cost you more or anything else. But they come into this country, they treat our workers, and the thing is, as I said, they cost you more than anything else because when the prices didn't seem to help, didn't help any poor people in this country. Then there's even higher prices. So, but they have to pay back, you know. They have to pay back the people who brought them in. I am only sorry that some of them didn't take the money that they got with these deals and put them in New York because we have a few more of them up there. This is what I'm saying all this thing is I am trying to encourage this new administration not to follow that path. Don't replace this Fiscal Incentives Act or don't go under the Duties, Taxes, and Other Payments Exemption Act to bring people into Barbados for your personal benefit. Because that is what happened in the last 10 years. We even heard about people coming to Barbados and getting duty-free Mercedes just before mind you, when Parliament was dissolved, but that order that gave us concessions has to come here. It has to be laid before the House and the Senate to be approved, and it has to come as soon as practicable. Well, I'm saying to this government that as soon as practicable has passed already. And I'm looking for that order because I want to see it here so we want to send a message to the people in this country that you mean business. You say you talk the talk, you want to see the act. This is an order made by the last minister, waiving duties and taxes on Mercedes and stuff for their friends. And the order is subject to, you have to lay that order in Parliament. It is subject to negative resolution, which means that it has to be laid in the House, and if within 40 days the House or the Senate does not annul it, it is good. But the 40 days don't come from when you make the order, it comes from 40 days from when it is laid here. So the 40 days didn't start counting yet. And I'm urging the Minister of Finance to lay the order so that we can have our say on it. I don't know if we will annul it because I only have one vote. But my vote will be voting to annul, I can tell you that. Because we cannot allow people to come to Barbados, bribe our officials, and treat our workers like anything else. I heard some instances where people were talking about how great the BIDC was, and my stomach started to boil, you know. Because this is the same BIDC and Invest Barbados that bring people into Barbados to exploit our workers. And in one instance, that I have proof, tell the company that was setting up, they had a business plan. And they tell the companies, oh, that is too much money to pay these people. And the principals of the company says this to the workers. They said, but the BIDC tell me that we're paying them too much. We had in our business plan how much we're going to pay you. This is what's happening. We've been allowing people in this country to exploit us. All right? Mind you, this same company, when you want to go to the bathroom, you got to go and get toilet paper. This is the kind of thing that they're doing to people in this country. You know? Look, I can't call names. You want to go to the bathroom, somebody else is there, you have to type in the chat to say emergency, so that the manager will allow you. This is happening in the harbor today. Still, today. I threatened the woman yesterday. I told her, look, we need to get you to Barbados. You come here, you treating people. Barbados, we don't have slaves in Barbados anymore. But this is what these concessions have done. We brought in, we want jobs badly, so we take anything that will come. I'm glad that the Fiscal Incentives Act is gone. It served its purpose. And it did well, because I know my brother and Senator Grant would tell you it did well because he had some shares in his pocket. But, yes, you know, but we now have to be careful. Having removed this, and we're going to go under another piece of legislation that is still there. It started in 1981. This duties, taxes, and duties, taxes, and other payments exemption act. It gave the minister carte blanche. He could waive anything. He could waive even national insurance. So when you want something done, you know, well, I'm not going to do that. I was going to put my hand on the table, but I'm tempted not to. And taxes are wiped off. You know, we have people in this country who have lots of VAT, and all of a sudden here, we waive the VAT. We do all this kind of stuff to keep them working here. We don't need them. We need people to come here and give good service to this country. Barbados work well, and they ought to be treated well. But when we invite them, and we have ministers in our pockets, and we can go, even bringing in these offshore medical schools, you know, they bring them in here and they treat the workers like the worst thing. If I tell you the stories that people endure at these places that we have encouraged in the last 10 years, I do not know why a government that talks about caring about people would allow this type of abuse to enter our shores. You now have a duty to correct all of these things. Right? Right? Sorry, and I'm saying, no, all of them cared. All cared. Right? But these are care even more. So I want to make sure that they can't say that they don't know. That is why I have, I'm grateful that the President allowed me to stray a little bit far from the Fiscal Incentives Act to make my point, that these things need to be corrected in Barbados. We need to stop this abuse, and I want the minister to, not to repeal this duties, taxes, and other payments act, but to use it sparingly. It was not used sparingly in the last 10 years. Anybody who was a friend of somebody got his taxes and duties waived. Mr. Chairman, I couldn't help myself. I listened to these speeches of everybody, and everybody was so good, and they were saying that these things most you could teach at university, for the staff are here coming out of you, you know? But I wanted to put these things in because everybody would tiptoe around, you know, the Mercedes and stuff. I don't tiptoe, sir. We need to get jobs, but we cannot bring people to exploit the workers in Barbados.
On a point of order, Mr. President, I have not risen for the entirety of the wonderful debate today, but I think Senator Franklin, and I'm referring to the standing order of the Senate, and I would like to draw to the President's attention or remind the President of Section 35 of the scope of the debate. We are now in the realms of mistreating workers, and we certainly will not stand for that. But the debate that we're here for today, and we have been here for the past 4 hours, relating to the repeal of the fiscal legislation, which has been excellently presented on all sides, is now being utilized as a mechanism to indulge in a form of appeal to wherever the constituent base may lie. I would like Senator Franklin to reserve, and this is my objection to the position of the point of order, to reserve his commentary and debate for the legislation which is before this Honourable House. That's my objection, Mr. President.
Mr. President, the Fiscal Incentives Act of Barbados.
I'm sorry, I rose on a point of order. I believe Mr. President has to respond.
Senator, he's called into question your relevance.
Sir, I was...
In part, if not in whole. I have given you kind of wide berth, but I think that you should bear in mind the objection taken.
Mr. President, I'm grateful and I'm thankful to the Senator too, because you see, I started out by talking about the Fiscal Incentives Act, which was designed to bring employment into Barbados. And when the objected, I'm talking about these people. These people brought people to Barbados too, you know. These people brought them to Barbados. I'm talking about. So you could only bring people to Barbados and mistreat all workers. So very well connected. Might not be connected in his mind, but certainly connected. You brought people into Barbados and the Fiscal Incentive Act. That's what the Fiscal Incentive Act did, provide employment. The employment that they provided might do the kind of abuse didn't exist back in the 70s and 80s because we had a very vibrant union and still vibrant, working toward...
Is your earlier statement not a contradiction?
Pardon?
Is your earlier premise not a contradiction?
No, sir, it's not contradictory. But the problem is that because the unions have to fight not only against the people that came in, they have to fight against the people who protected them, the people who gave them the concessions. That is why the unions wasn't making the kind of headway, because it couldn't appeal to the minister of anything, because the minister of anything had the minister was giving the waivers. You see? So that is the problem, you know. Not that the unions didn't know what to do, it is just that they were butting up against a wall, because if you report to them, you ain't getting no response. You know, so it is very well connected, sir. It is connected in the sense that these people come in and they're abusing our workers. I want it stopped, and I don't want it continue under any other piece of legislation. The Fiscal Incentives Act is gone. I don't want the duties tax, and I don't want to take away all the minister's power, but I want to say, sir, that under this legislation, I'm tempering your use of it. But so far, I haven't seen anything coming from this administration that I have to quarrel about in that regard. But I just want to tell you, don't follow bad examples, because those examples can lead you to ankle bracelets. Thank you, sir.
Mr. President, as I rise to wrap up the debate on this bill, I want to thank all honourable senators who spoke in what I consider to be an outstanding debate on this matter. particularly want to, however, highlight the contribution of Senator Cummings for her exposition on these issues. But there are one or two comments, not many, some of them have been answered, in terms of Senator Drake's in reference to looking at the things like Sea Island cotton. This is not lost on us, and this is something that this government will certainly pursue. A lot of work was done when we were last occupying the halls of power, and I'm sure that the documents will be dusted up, or dusted off, and we will look at them again. In terms of the utilization of aloe vera, I'm sure she should also know that it is very good at. Indeed, in a number of hand creams, and especially coming from Israel, you'll see aloe barbadensis, which means in the botanical name, it is recognized as Barbadian aloe vera. Senator Nurse was asking how many companies are currently who would be affected. And I believe them at present there are 4 companies which are beneficiaries of the concessions. Again, on the app, 3 of the companies, the benefits will expire at the end of 2018, while 1 will expire in 2021. And within this, they've made provision for that. In the last 5 years, there have been fewer than 5 applications. I hope you can see the names of the companies that have applied. Some of them have been very topical, but they've applied. 1 applied in November 2015. 2 have applied in February and May 2017, Mr. President. Some names of some very well-known companies and popular companies in Barbados. And obviously these have not been approved because of the condition recognizing that the expiry was going to come in force in December 2015. Senator Adams isn't here, but he made comments. He took us into the realm of correspondent banking and de-risking. And these are matters that the government is well aware of in terms of the discussions at the level of the EU and the OECD. We have spoken about this in terms of the unfairness in their policies as regards some European countries and also the state of Delaware. I should mention here for the benefit of honorable senators that on the 1st of October, a delegation of CARICOM prime ministers will be meeting with the EU finance ministers in Luxembourg to raise this issue, and certainly our prime minister will be in Geneva that same day, where there will be discussions with the French and other officials in terms of these issues. So for him, this is not a matter that is lost on us. As regards Senator Franklin, I've been informed that the duties, taxes, and other payments exemption order, cost you less Barbados, order, Inc., order 2015, was duly laid in this honorable chamber on Wednesday, the 10th of February, 2016 at 11:05 a.m., and that there was no need for any resolution, but certainly if the honorable senator is desirous of having some clarification, the section on the agenda referring to private members can be duly utilized by him. Not now.
A point of clarification, sir. The elucidation, I think you'd like to call it that. I wasn't speaking about the cost less order. I was speaking about the one that was made when the House was dissolved and an order was made granted. I know the cost less time was done in 2005. At 2016, 5 years after it was made. I know that. It was, they allowed everything to happen, and then 5 years later they laid the order. When it's supposed to be laid as soon as practicable, it took them 5 years. I know that one, so I know that was laid. But the one, I'm talking about the one that hasn't come yet. The one that was made just before, and it hasn't gotten here yet. That's what I'm talking about. I want that one here. So please go, sir, and get that order as soon as possible.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy President. I obviously misunderstood the honorable senator. I will endeavor to seek clarity from him after this sitting. Mr. Deputy President, with these few words. I will certainly have taken into consideration also the recommendations of Senator Cummings in terms of her recommendations, and I would like to assure Senator Nurse that we have been looking at some of the amendments that you mentioned that were made in some Caribbean countries, some of our CARICOM brothers, in terms of what they have done when they repealed it. We've looked at Antigua and Barbuda, St. Lucia. Indeed, the Senator made reference to the situation in Jamaica, where they have made some change amendments. And indeed, in Trinidad and Tobago, where they recognized that they had to look at a whole, I believe it was 6 acts that they had to look at modifying to become compliant in this regard. And notably, they've made, similar to the recommendation made by Senator Cummings and made by you, sir, in terms of the need to look at research and development facility benefits within this whole thing of encouraging manufacturing. With these few words, Mr. President, I'd like to move that the Fiscal Incentives Repeal Bill 2018 be now read a second time.
Question is that this bill be now read a second time. All those members in favor, please vote aye.
Aye.
Those against, please vote no. I think the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that Your Honor do not leave the chair and the Senate resolve itself into committee for further consideration of this bill.
Question is that this House now resolve itself into a committee of the whole Senate for the further consideration of this bill. All those members in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it, and I now have set myself for the Deputy President to take over.
The House is now in committee.
Clause 1.
Deputy President, I beg to move that Clause 1 stand part.
The question is that Clause 1 stand part. All honorable senators in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those senators against, please say no. We think the ayes have it.
Clause 2.
Deputy President, I beg to move that Clause 2 stand part.
The question is that Clause 2 stand part. All honorable senators in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it.
Mr. President, Deputy President, I beg to move that you do not report to His Honor the President the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do not report to His Honor the President the passing of one bill in committee. Honorable members in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
The chairman has reported to me the passage of one bill in committee.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill be now read a third time.
The motion is that this bill be now read a third time. All those honorable members in favor, please vote aye. Aye. Those vote against, please vote no. I think the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill do now pass and be cited as the Fiscal Incentives Repeal Act 2018.
Question is that this bill be now read a third time and be so cited. All honorable members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it.
Mr. President, this brings us to the end of government business for today, and I now beg to move that the Senate be adjourned until Wednesday, September the 19th.
September the 19th?
Yes, 19th. 19th.
Yes. Motion is that this House be now adjourned until September 19th, 2018. All honorable members in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. I think the House will now stand adjourned, the Senate, until the date indicated, September 19th. He will be here on that occasion. He assures me that he will be. But if in truth and in fact I will not be here, you will know well in advance. I so assure you. Thank you.